I'm Indy Nidell.
And I'm Berns.
And this is another thrilling episode of the Baseball History Time Machine.
They're all thrilling.
That they are.
And what thrilling things are we going to talk about today?
Well, I was thinking about Bob Carruthers.
Oh, I love Bob Carruthers.
Me too. And with that in mind, I thought I'd not talk about him, but about something he was involved in.
Well, do you want to remind people who Bob Carruthers was?
Sure. Bob Carruthers was a two-way player like Shohei Ohtani. We talked about him some in episode number 1. He was a huge star in the 1880s and for a time the highest paid player in baseball. Unlike some other talented pitcher position players like Babe Ruth, he did not choose one or the other, but he both pitched and played outfield for his whole career, except his final season when his pitching arm was gone. He played just the field that year.
But this episode's not about him.
No, that is further down the line. See, I know that you like Bob Carruthers, who played for St. Louis for a while, but you are a Chicago Cubs fan. So I thought I'd talk about the beginning of the St. Louis-Chicago rivalry and the 2 World Series they played against each other, those in 1885 and 1886.
But both Chicago and St. Louis are in the same league.
But they weren't then, right? See, the team that is now the St. Louis Cardinals was not always called that. In the National League in 1899, they were called the Perfectos, for example.
That's quite a silly name, actually.
It's also not a very good description since they finished in 5th place that year. But anyhow, before that, they were the St. Louis Browns in the National League.
When I think of the Browns, I think of them as an American League team.
But that is a different team. The 20th century American League Browns do not have a relation to the Cardinals. And they moved to Baltimore after the 1953 season and became the Baltimore Orioles, right? That's who they are now. The National League St. Louis Browns of the 1890s became part of the National League in 1892 when the National League and American Association consolidated. The AA was a major league before that, right? In the 1880s, though, the Browns were the unquestioned kings of the association, winning 4 straight pennants, 1885 to 1888.
That's a dynasty.
It sure is, but it is not the first one in Major League Baseball. Chicago, today the Cubs, won National League pennants in 1880, 81, 82, 85, and 86.
Go Chicago!
Yeah. I want to make you happy sometimes by doing episodes
Thank you.
that work for
you. I appreciate it.
But now those last 2 seasons, 1885 and 1886, they faced off against the Browns in the World Series.
You said that before. I thought that the World Series began in 1903, though.
That's the modern World Series between the winners of the National League and American League. There was an earlier World Series, which from 1884 to 1890 was the winner of the National League versus the winner of the American Association, and in 1892 was the first and second half of the season winners of the National League against each other, right?
Did anybody play in both, the old one and the new one?
None other than Cy Young himself did. He played in the last old one in 1892 and the first new one in 1903.
Actually, I think I knew that the old World Series existed, but I thought they were just exhibition games, so to speak.
Okay, here's how you know that something is an exhibition, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are they playing for money? Yes. Is it substantial money? Yes. Is it like a big part of their annual salary level money? Yes. Do the winners get a lot more money than the losers? Yes. Right?
Okay, so they're playing to win, obviously.
Like if you were playing for, like, if your work had a team, had a baseball team, and you were on the team, and you were playing against some other company, and they say, oh, it's just an exhibition. But by the way, we're getting paid, and the winners get more money than the losers.
That's
and it's
bragging
like,
rights.
is that
Yeah,
that's not an exhibition.
No, I'm playing to win.
They're playing to win. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, wait till I get to the games. Both series were completely crazy, especially 1886 when it was really crazy.
Okay, wait, you're not going to go straight there then?
No, I have to do a little setup first. We have to start in the 1870s.
Okay, lay the foundation for me.
There was a rivalry between St. Louis and Chicago before baseball became part of it. St. Louis, thanks to all the river traffic on the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers, had been the center of trade for the whole region. But with the rise of the railroads, the completion of the Pacific Railroad in 1869, connecting the 2 American coasts, the West and East Coast, and the rapidly expanding railway network with Chicago as a hub, this changed. And Chicago was passing St. Louis in stature. The Civil War, which remember is only a few years in the past at this point, had made this process faster by sabotaging the river trade.
Things you learn here.
The things you learn. How about this? The 1880 census has Chicago's population larger than St. Louis for the first time. But John Cash's book, Before They Were Cardinals, says this was actually the case already in 1870.
Wait, was it just not reported?
Well, a guy named William McKee, who controlled federal patronage in Missouri thanks to President Grant, had the St. Louis census figures withheld until after the Chicago ones came out. Then he got fraudulent figures filed, so everyone thought St. Louis was still bigger.
That's a dirty, dirty trick.
It is, and McKee should have seen that it was only delaying the inevitable anyhow, since the Transcontinental Railway was the big final game changer. Anyhow, in the early 1870s, baseball was a hot new sport for much of the nation, and the rivalry between the two cities impelled St. Louis to want to create a team that was better than mighty Chicago.
Was Chicago really mighty back then?
In 1870, they put together money to field a fully professional team that was to be as good or better than the legendary 1869 Cincinnati Red Stockings, the first openly all-professional team, who went that whole season undefeated. Chicago was the first city to try to copy this success.
And I'm guessing they succeeded to some degree when you put it like that, and you said that they were mighty.
They did. The brand new 1870 Chicago White Stockings beat the Red Stockings and claimed to be the best in the West. But even before doing that, they had gone to St. Louis already in April and destroyed the two best local clubs, the Empires and the Unions, 36-8 and 47-1. They came back in October and wreaked similar havoc.
Wait, what about the Great Chicago Fire then?
That was in October 1871. But in April 1871, to get ready for the first season of the new National Association, the first professional baseball league-like entity, and which did not feature a team from St. Louis, the White Stockings returned to St. Louis and beat two local teams 22-2 and 34-8.
That's a pounding. And then the Fire came right after that season, right?
Yeah, and then the White Stockings did not field the team the next 2 years because of the damage of the Great Fire. But before the 1874 National Association season, which they once again played, they came back to St. Louis and in 8 straight victories outscored local teams 179-53.
Jeez, that's humiliating.
That is putting it mildly. St. Louis decided to finally put together a professional team pretty much solely to destroy the Chicago White Stockings. This was the St. Louis Brown Stockings.
All right. Why is everybody just different colored stockings?
Most uniforms were white because dyeing them was expensive. But if everyone wore white, then how do you tell the teams apart? Hence, one simple colored item of clothing.
Yeah, that's cheap and pretty clever.
On May 6, 1875, the brown and white stockings finally battled.
And this was a big deal back then.
This was a massive deal in both cities. The St. Louis correspondent for the Chicago Tribune wrote the day before, "Never in the history of baseballdom has there been a greater fever in this city than over the game to be played tomorrow."
Never in the history of baseballdom is quite good writing, actually.
The first professional baseball game, played between St. Louis and Chicago, had 8,000 fans jam-packed in Grand Avenue Park in St. Louis, and another 2,000 or so were in trees and on rooftops or anywhere they could see the game from.
Yeah, you don't really think of numbers like that when you think of baseball in the 1870s, right?
You should, though. Baseball fever was sweeping the nation.
Okay, so how was the action then?
Pretty lopsided, but in St. Louis's favor. Brown Stockings ace George Washington Bradley shut out Chicago 10-0 on 4 measly hits. There was utter pandemonium in St. Louis and utter despair in Chicago, for this was, in fact, the worst loss the White Stockings had ever had.
That's some serious payback. Talk about revenge.
Well, it's not over. This was a 2-game series, and Game 2 was played 2 days later on the 8th. An estimated 9,000 people watched the game, including General William Sherman, who sat in the press box.
I think of him as quite a historical figure, but this feels like it's happening like right now.
And that's what I'm shooting for with this podcast, because these are real people doing real stuff. Unlike the first game, this game was exciting, at least at the end. Bradley pitched again, and he extended his scoreless streak against Chicago to 17 innings as the Brown Stockings built a 4-0 lead, but Chicago mounted a furious rally in the 9th.
Come on, Chicago!
A walk and 3 hits cut the lead to 4-2, and Chicago had the tying runs on base with no outs.
Oh, come on.
2 ground outs to first made it 4-3, with the tying run now on third base and 2 outs.
Come on, White Stockings, let's go.
Alas for Chicago, a ground out to short ended the game with a 1-run loss.
I still would have loved to see that, though.
Yeah, me too. But don't worry, I have even more exciting games to talk about today. This was just setup.
Okay, are you done with the setup, though?
Pretty much. There's plenty more relevant stuff that maybe I'll cover another day about the 1875 National Association season and the 1876 and 1877 National League seasons, which featured both teams in the same league. But you get the idea, right? This was suddenly the biggest rivalry in the country on the baseball field.
Yeah, I totally get that.
Find yourself looking for a new job or change in career? Monster.com is here to help. We are not only here to bring you job postings, but also AI interview prep and salary tools, expert career advice, and top-notch resume services. We've got everything you need to land your perfect job fit. Discover the magic of finding the ideal job with Monster.com. Your future starts now. Visit Monster.com today. Your next job opportunity is just a click away.
Cut to 1885.
1885?
Chicago is a steamroller. They won the National League 1880 to 1882, finished second in 1883, but were only fifth out of 8 teams in 1884 as the Providence Grays rolled to the pennant, winning it with a .750 winning percentage, which, since 1900, only the 1906 Cubs have topped.
So why was Providence so good that year?
Well, that was the year old Hoss Radbourn, Charlie Radbourn, put on one of the greatest pitching performances in history, going 60-12 with a 1.38 ERA in 678 innings.
678 innings. That's 4 times what people pitch right now.
He pitched 632 the year before during another unbelievable season.
That's over 1,300 innings in 2 years. That's Iron Man stuff right there.
That's serious Iron Man stuff. During that time, he went 108 and 37. But here's the thing. Hoss spent one game in 1884 deliberately lobbing in balls, basically tanking that game on purpose.
And why would he do such a thing?
Well, Charlie Sweeney, who everyone said had the evil eye, was nearly as good as Radbourn was with Providence the first half of the season as the Grays' other starter. They had just the 2. But those 2 hated each other. I will say again that it was apparently, from what I've read, really easy to hate Charlie Sweeney. And I will for sure do an episode on Radbourn Sweeney in 1884. But just for now, I'll say here that Rad, which he's sometimes called in the papers, Rad wanted Sweeney gone, and he tanked the game to indicate that that was what he'd continue to do as long as Sweeney was still around. So Sweeney was sent packing, and Radbourn said he would only continue the season, right, if he pitched every single game remaining in the season. And the Providence powers that be said, yeah, okay.
Not much of a choice, but every single game. How much of the season was left at that point?
Well, Sweeney lost his final start with Providence that year on July 22nd, which made Providence 43-19. Then the team went an amazing 41-7 the rest of the year, which was the first year the National League expanded to 112 games in a season. Providence also had 3 ties that year.
So 41-7. Did Old Hoss pitch all 48 of those remaining games?
He did not, but he pitched most of them, and at one point 22 in a row, and 28 out of 29, and he had his most impressive stretch going 30 wins and 2 losses, with the 2 losses being against Hall of Famers Mickey Welch, a 2-1 loss in 11 innings, and Pud Galvin, a 2-0 loss. In between those losses was an 18-game winning streak.
That sounds like the best season ever.
I'm not going to argue, but remember, he did lose a game on purpose.
Okay, so how did Charlie Sweeney do that year?
When Sweeney left Providence, he was 17-8 with a 1.55 ERA. And then he went 24-7 with the St. Louis Maroons in the Union Association to end up 41-15 with a 1.70 ERA.
Those are some staggering numbers.
They sure are, but he never again had a winning season, which isn't saying much since he was out of baseball 3 years later. But I'm getting sidetracked.
You always do.
I always do, yes. I don't want to talk about 1884. My point is that Providence cruised to the pennant and then beat the New York Mets in the first ever World Series.
They beat the Mets, but the Mets have only been around since, the 1960s?
Baseball is nothing if not a game of tradition. And when the new National League franchise began playing in New York in 1962, they took the name of the old American Association franchise from the 1880s, the New York Mets, short for Metropolitans.
Okay, I had no idea. That's amazing.
Well, there were people alive in 1962 who, remembered the old New York Mets.
Mm-hmm.
And the Mets in 1884 were the original Amazing Mets, which is what the 1969 Mets were called. Since no one picked them to win the association, but they did, although Radbourn utterly dominated them in 3 games in the series. It was a 3-game World Series. Mm-hmm. He gave up 0 earned runs, and the Grays won 6-0, 3-1, and 12-2, with New York scoring only 3 unearned runs.
That's total domination.
That is total domination. Okay, in 1885, Chicago won the pennant with an even better winning percentage than Providence had in 1884. But they did not have an easy time of things. As I said last week, in the Sluggers of the 30s episode, where I got sidetracked about the New York Giants, the New York Giants were the best second-place team of all time in 1885, and they only finished 2 games out of first with a .759 winning percentage. Philadelphia was in third place, exactly 30 games out of first place in an 8-team league.
So it was just a tight 2-team race, and 6 also ran.
More than pretty much any season in history. Those White Stockings were magnificent, featuring 3 of the greatest 19th century players of all, Cap Anson, King Kelly, and John Clarkson. And also big stars like George Gore, Ned Williamson, and Abner Dalrymple. They were loaded.
Okay, but what about St. Louis, though?
They were led by their 2 pitching aces, Bob Carruthers and Scissors Fouts, who pitched 482 and 407 innings respectively, and went a combined 73 and 27.
Wow, with 2 guys that good, imagine having a 1-2 punch like that today.
Thing is, we really see 2 different types of players here. The Browns pioneered what would become the dominant style of play from the 1890s for nearly 30 years. A scrappy, fast-paced, run-on-anything, lots of steals, forcing errors style of play, while Chicago were big guys who hit the ball hard.
Yeah, that's a big difference, like small ball versus just
Power
absolute
ball.
power. Yeah.
Well, I
pretty much.
say this, but there was one glaring exception. Big Tip O'Neill was the St. Louis Brown who broke the mold. He hit .350 in half a season's play in 1885. 2 years later, in 1887, he would hit .435 and be the only man in Major League history to lead the league in doubles, triples, and homers in the same season.
Wow, wasn't he Canadian?
He was, and he came up as a pitcher, but like Babe Ruth 35 years later, switched to the outfield full-time because of his booming bat.
So these guys face off in the 1885 World Series.
They do, and it was exciting as hell. In fact, I'm going to set the scene again.
Okay.
Now, this is a quote from the prologue of that book I mentioned before they were Cardinals. Great book. But the information in it is from 2 St. Louis newspapers and 1 Missouri one from the October 8th, 1885 editions.
All right, let's hear it.
You're going to like this. Okay, this is a quote. On October 7th, 1885, Thomas A. Hendricks, the Vice President of the United States, looked out from the balcony of the Southern Hotel on a parade making its way through the crowded streets below. More than 250,000 people were milling around, many carrying torches that sent flames leaping 15 feet into the air.
That's a party.
Some torchbearers were periodically setting off Roman candles, and other parade participants fired double-barreled shotguns skyward.
Damn, I wish they still did this. This sounds nuts.
Okay, the quote continues. Hang on. Although, yeah, I wish they still did.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Hendricks assumed that the pandemonium below was a well-intentioned effort to welcome him to St. Louis. Sure that he was the focal point of the crowd's attentions, he began to deliver a political speech to the audience.
Oh, that's a mistake.
This, gentlemen, is an honor I did not expect. It must be only in the West the greatness of the vice presidency is recognized. But he gets cut off by someone yelling, "There's Gleason! There's Gleason!" Hendricks asks, "And who, may I ask, is Gleason?" And the guy goes, "Just the greatest shortstop the Browns ever had, and this is one of the reasons why we're going to beat Chicago for the championship."
Yeah, that does not sound like an exhibition series
It does not.
And 250,000 people? Really? That many?
Well, I can't say whether that's totally accurate or not, but it was obviously thousands upon thousands of them, and likely at least 100 or 120, if not 250, right?
And firing shotguns into the air?
Firing shotguns into the air. And a week after the parade, on October 14th, 1885, the Browns were in Chicago to play the first game of the World Series. And fun fact, this was the first one that was called the World's Series, apparently named so by St. Louis sports writer Al Spink.
Al Spink?
He was Canadian-born.
Like Tip O'Neill.
Like Tip O'Neill. And he was more than a mere sports writer. Here in 1885, he is the American Association's secretary, but is also unofficially the Browns secretary and press agent. Next year, he will leave all this to found the Sporting News.
That was like the baseball Bible for a long time, right? Like Al Spink started all that?
Yeah, he did. And there are a couple of sources that claim that he came up with the name World's Series. So I'm going to roll with them. Browns owner Chris von der Ahe and White Stockings owner Al Spalding agreed that the teams would play 12 games in 18 days in 7 cities.
Now that does sound like an exhibition series.
It does, though it was to begin in Chicago and St. Louis. But there were problems. The rules differed a little between the two leagues. The National League charged 50 cents a game, did not allow alcohol to be served, and did not play on Sundays. The American Association, which is known as the Beer and Whiskey League, very much did sell alcohol. I mean, Chris von der Ahe owned a saloon right by the ballpark even. And AA teams also played on Sundays everywhere where it was not actually against the law, which it was in places at the time. And they charged 25 cents admission.
Okay, this is interesting.
Their managers, or captains, also had quite different philosophies. Chicago's Cap Anson levied a $100 fine, that's $1885, on any of his players caught drinking beer, and did nightly room checks to enforce curfew when they were on the road. St. Louis's Charlie Comiskey was more of a look the other way kind of guy.
So this is really a battle of the two opposites, basically.
It really is. The bigger, stronger White Stockings versus the smaller, speedier Browns. And the opening game featured the best pitcher in the National League versus the best pitcher in the American Association, John Clarkson, against
Please say Parisian Bob Carruthers.
Parisian Bob Carruthers, yes. It was an exciting game. The Brownies go out to a 5-1 lead, but in the bottom of the 8th, Chicago scores 4 to tie the game, mainly thanks to Fritz Pfeffer's 3-run homer. But it gets dark fairly early in Chicago in October, and Dave Sullivan, the umpire, called the game a tie because of darkness before the 9th inning.
A World Series tie.
Oh, yes. Game 2 was the next day, the 15th, in St. Louis. The White Stockings struck first, but the Browns, forcing errors and executing double steals, came back to have a 4-2 lead after 5.
Yeah, this is still anybody's game at this point.
Thing is, the Browns and their fans believed it should have been larger because Dave Sullivan was making questionable calls.
Damn, I love some drama.
Well, you're going to get it. In the 3rd inning, Fouts hit what is called by some sources to be a clear double down the right field line, a foot or more fair, but was called foul. Fouts then struck out. Also that inning, Sam Barkley was called out on a 3rd strike, supposedly above his head. So the crowd is really riled up and angry as the game goes on.
Yeah, I'd not like to be in Sullivan's shoes at this point.
The 6th inning started with the, in the future, enormously famous evangelist Billy Sunday, but in 1885, the fairly famous Chicago outfielder Billy Sunday, doubling to right and then going to 3rd on a passed ball. Now here's where things really go south. King Kelly grounds to short. Gleason bobbles the ball, but gets it to first in plenty of time to throw out Kelly. Sunday scores. But Sullivan, the lone umpire, was expecting a play at the plate, so he was watching there and not first base, and he calls Kelly safe at first. I should point out, even the Chicago Tribune will write that Kelly was out by at least 10 feet.
That's not close by any means. Like, that's a horrible call.
It's a blown call in the World Series. So Comiskey confronts Sullivan and says he should recuse himself from umpiring duties for the rest of the game. And Sullivan says, okay, and walks off the field. And Anson goes, no, we're not changing umpires, and gets Sullivan back on the field.
Oh, wow, I'm loving this.
The crowd is even angrier, right? And Anson is now in an argument with the Browns vice president, who happens to be a congressman. Comiskey tells Sullivan that if he doesn't get off the field, the Browns will. Sullivan says if that happens, he'll forfeit the game to Chicago. So all the players are now milling around. Sullivan tells Anson and Comiskey they have 2 minutes to sort all this out between them, and 10 minutes later, play resumes.
Good Lord.
It gets worse, though. Kelly, who should have been called out, steals second and scores on an Anson single. Anson is forced at second, so there's 1 out with Pfeffer on first. But then Williamson hits a slow roller down the first line. It's foul most of the journey, but spins in and hits first base. Pfeffer scores the tying run. Comiskey explodes, claiming Sullivan had already called the ball foul before it hit the bag. Sullivan says no he didn't, and Anson says it was he who called it foul, which is weird. But then Comiskey says, well, you know what? Under American Association rules, the ball should be a foul. Sullivan is a National League umpire, and he thinks, oh, okay, this is some AA rule I just didn't know. So he changes his call to a foul ball. Now, I should point out, the actual foul rules at the time are the same in both the National League and American Association. Okay, Anson and Kelly think Comiskey's bluffing, and they say, show us in the rule book. But Comiskey is unable to produce an American Association rule book, so Sullivan changes the call again to a fair ball.
No. I don't think it's going to end well for Sullivan, to be fair.
You are right. A couple hundred local men start to descend to the field to beat the crap out of the umpire. Park security gets him out of the park, and the Browns, well, they leave the park too.
So that's a forfeit then, right?
This is the tricky bit.
Oh, this is the tricky bit?
Yeah, this is the tricky bit. From his hotel, Sullivan rules the game a forfeit because the Browns left the field. But the Browns counter, they left the field with the White Stockings to avoid the mob, not before. And furthermore, and what is an actual rule, Sullivan did not issue the forfeit at the actual playing site, but from the hotel. So it doesn't count as a forfeit under AA rules. The newspapers disagree as to exactly when the Browns do leave the field, with them surprisingly getting supported by the Chicago Tribune.
Oh, this is fascinating.
Game 3 is on the 16th and is again Clarkson versus Carruthers. Carruthers doesn't have his best stuff, but he manages to hold off the White Stockings after being given a 5-1 lead in the first on 5 unearned runs against poor Clarkson and some terrible Chicago fielding, which is 5-3 by the fourth. Stays there for a few innings, and the Browns then add 2 more. With 2 outs in the ninth, Chicago scores another run, but Carruthers' 7th strikeout brings victory to the Browns.
And a full 9 innings for once.
Full 9 innings. Game 4 is again Jim McCormick and Scissors Fouts, who pitched Game 2. This is also marred by controversy over umpires' calls, the umpire being a St. Louis local named William Medar. Chicago is up 2-1 in the 8th, but aggressive base running and poor fielding turned that into a 3-2 Browns victory. But the 9th inning sees McCormick refusing to leave base after being called out, and Billy Sunday, future evangelist, assuming a boxing pose in front of Medard.
But it's still a Browns win, right?
It is still a Browns win, and we've had 4 close games in 4 close days. But it is then that the 4-day break and the schedule of leaving Chicago and St. Louis causes fans to lose interest. Honest John Kelly, one of the country's most respected umpires, is called on to umpire all future games.
Okay, how many of those umpires were there?
Well, there were 7 games total in the series. Pittsburgh was the next stop, and with freezing weather and no home team playing, only 500 or so people came to watch Game 5, which was the White Stockings walloping the Browns 9-2. Game 6 in Cincinnati was another 9-2 Chicago win in front of like 1,500 people. Game 7 brings the end of the series in Cincinnati and the start of a new controversy.
Another one.
Yes. See, before the game, Honest John, after a request from both captains, Anson and Comiskey, tells the crowd this is the deciding game and that Chicago no longer claims victory in the forfeited Game 2. So the series is tied at 2-2, and this will decide the championship.
The plot thickens.
Comiskey, well, he has nothing to lose by this arrangement, and it seems Anson agreed out of overconfidence after the past 2 big victories. In fact, when Clarkson, his ace, who was supposed to pitch, arrives 5 minutes late to the park, Anson benches him, and McCormick, who pitched Game 6 the day before, has to pitch again, and he faces Fouts, who pitched Game 5.
So is it a close game?
It is not. McCormick tires after a few innings, and after throwing a 2-hitter in Game 6, gives up 12 hits in Game 7, and the Browns cruise to a 13-4 victory.
So did they win the series or not?
Well, because of the pregame announcement, both the Chicago and St. Louis papers hailed the Browns as World Series champions.
Well, that should settle it, right?
But Chicago owner Al Spalding says he never renounced the forfeit, and Anson had no authority to make such a claim. He also connives to get the $1,000 prize money put up by the owners before the series returned to them, and then claims that that proves it was a tie and no one won. And also, Spalding's official baseball guide, the popular national publication, calls it a tie. Opinion at the time was pretty divided as to whether the Browns were champs or not, but nowadays it's listed in pretty much all sources, like at baseballreference.com, as a tie.
So what do you think it was?
Personally, I think the announcement before the game, which very much did happen and was agreed to by both managers and both teams, kind of tips the scales. And the Browns are the champs, and the forfeit was not called at the site of the game anyhow, which was the official rule, so that shouldn't count as a forfeit. I don't know, what do you think?
Well, given these circumstances, I think a tie is fair, especially after the amount of drama that we've just gone through.
But the most important thing here for this podcast is that this very much sets the stage for the rematch in the 1886 World Series, which ends with the most famous play in all of 19th century baseball.
Okay, let's do it.
No, this is already the longest episode so far. I'm going to have to come back next week and cover the majesty of the 1886 World Series, which was only played in Chicago and St. Louis, and ended with something called the $15,000 slide.
That's still a lot of money even today, but in 1886, I assume that was a hell of a lot of money.
$15,000. That's a lot of money. That's plenty of money. But that's the $15,000 slide, the most famous play in 19th century baseball, and we will get back to that next week because this is only part 1.
All right, everybody. We'll be back next week for part 2. I personally can't wait.
Well, and that is it for today for the Baseball History Time Machine. Once again, go to patreon.com and look up the Baseball History Time Machine or Indy Nidell's Baseball History Time Machine and join us there, because the more help we get there, the more time we can spend writing these extravaganzas without doing other stuff. And you also get our content ad-free when you join us. And that'll allow us to expand and do shorts and things like that. And Berns, you can put stuff on social media. All right, we will be back next week.